Welcome at our Symposium on Improving Decision-Making across the drug life cycle in challenging times. This symposium consists of 4 sessions. Our PhD students and renowned experts will provide you insights onto the topics. Minister of Health and Social Affairs Frank van den Broeke will be our guest in each of the sessions. And you will have the opportunity to ask questions along the talks via the chat box function. Today, I welcome you to the first session on patient involvement in drug development and evaluation, introduced by Evelien de Sutter, who performs her PhD on electronic personalized informed consent. I hope you may enjoy the sessions.
This patient is called Caroline. Caroline suffers from a disease and she uses a treatment that could improve her health condition. Several stakeholders were involved in the development of this treatment and in making this treatment available for Caroline, such as the pharmaceutical industry, regulatory authorities, and healthcare professionals. However, only Caroline knows what matters to her most in the management of her health condition. Caroline has unique perspectives and insights about her disease and the treatment that she uses. And for this reason, several stakeholders are investigating ways to involve patients such as Caroline across the drug life cycle. When patients are involved across the drug life cycle, it means that research is done with them or by them. Let me now provide some examples of patient involvement across the drug life cycle. Patients can be involved in the development phase. They can provide inputs on medical needs, or they can help to set research priorities by informing decisions on which drugs would be valuable and appropriate to develop. Patients can also be involved in the clinical development phase. Patients need to be able to make an informed decision on whether or not they wish to participate in a clinical trial. The informed consent process is a process of providing meaningful information to these patients to truly inform them about several aspects of the trial, such as the design or the risks and the benefits. However, current informed consent documents often contain specialized medical and legal terminology, which may be difficult to understand for these patients. So patient involvement when drawing up the informed consent could be of benefit to improve the readability of these consent forms. Patients can also be involved in the post-marketing phase. They can provide feedback on the ease of use or on the long-term side effects when using a drug in practice. Let's now return to Caroline. Patients such as Caroline are the end users of a treatment, and for this reason, they are the most important stakeholder in the context of patient-centered care. And by involving patients across the drug life cycle, they can put their perspectives and their knowledge to the table, and they can, together with other stakeholders, co-create solutions to develop better treatments and to bring these treatments to the patients. To make it possible that patients are involved across the drug life cycle, it is important that all stakeholders bundle forces. One of these most important stakeholders is the Belgian government. And for this reason, we will listen to key insights provided by the Minister for Social Affairs and Public Health, Frank van den Broeke, on the evolution of patient involvement in the Belgian healthcare setting. Actually, there are several ways to involve patients across the drug life cycle. One of these ways is related to patient preferences. My colleague Rosanne Janssens is conducting patient preference studies which aim to inform decisions in the context of drug development and evaluation. And today, she will discuss a patient preference study conducted with multiple myeloma patients. Another way to involve patients across the drug life cycle is related to shared decision-making. Niki Ver Donck, who obtained a PhD in pharmaceutical sciences, researching shared decision-making, will discuss the value of a decision aid and how this decision aid can be used in practice. And the third way related to patient involvement is patient engagement. Jan Geissler, the founder and CEO of Patvocates, will discuss the value of patient engagement in the clinical trial design.
Thank you, Evelien, for this introduction. In view of patient centricity in the drug development and evaluation, we asked our Minister Frank van den Broeke the following. What is your view on patient centricity and how do you see it evolving, especially in the context of the Belgian healthcare setting?
Well, it is definitely important to involve patients and more generally people who develop expertise on the basis of their personal experience. Empowerment and participation are important per se, but this is also an issue of improving the quality of policies. So patients should be at the center of the entire life cycle of a drug. This needs to be translated into involvement from an early stage onwards, for instance, setting up dialogues with universities on unmet medical needs, and all the way up to the discussion on how to use real-world data. A significant tool here will be digital health, which I truly believe can empower both patients and healthcare providers. And furthermore, one of my transversal priorities is the improvement of health literacy. Giving patients access to their medical files through digital platforms is one important aspect of this, but it's obviously not enough. On the one hand, we have to be aware that there is a big gap in digital skills in Belgium, so there is a lot to do to work on this. On the other hand, the future probably lies there. Currently, my administration is preparing a bill in which we foresee the establishment of a consultation body for patient organizations within the structure of RISIF. This so-called patient forum aims to establish a direct and a structural dialogue between patient organizations and RISIF in all the areas of its competence, in order to better understand the concerns, suggestions, proposals of patients. In doing so, we will increase their voice and their involvement as stakeholders in policy development. We also plan to reform the Commission of Reimbursement of Medicines. When we do that, we will look at the results of the Citizen Lab of the King Baudouin Foundation. The Citizen Panel clearly gave priority to quality of life and prevention. Also, in order to increase transparency and health literacy, it is valuable to inform patients in a much more accessible way about reimbursement decisions.
Patient preferences is also the topic of the PhD of Rosanne Janssens, who collaborates in a large network with profit and non-profit organizations in IMI Prefer.
Let's go back to Caroline. Let's imagine that Caroline is diagnosed with multiple myeloma. Multiple myeloma is a cancer that is characterized by a proliferation of plasma cells in Caroline's bone marrow. And this proliferation causes several symptoms like renal insufficiency, easily fracturing of Caroline's bones, and higher susceptibility to infections, etc. And multiple myeloma is therefore categorized as a debilitating cancer, but it's also a life-threatening cancer. Caroline and other multiple myeloma patients have, on a 5-year time, less than 50% chance to survive. However, several treatments are currently in development and aim to increase the survival rates of multiple myeloma patients. And these treatments have innovative mechanisms of actions. And we think about CAR T-cell therapies, immunotherapies, who all aim to fight cancer of Caroline. However, these treatments are also associated with severe risks and uncertainties, like neuropathic effects, as well as sepsis, multi-organ failure, and uncertainties on long-term for Caroline and other multiple myeloma patients. Among stakeholders like Caroline, physicians, but also drug developers, HTA bodies, and regulators, this creates uncertainties about the treatment outcomes that matter most to patients like Caroline. So this uncertainty is present among patients who have to decide together with their physician on what the best treatment is for them. And this will be addressed by Niki in her presentation, but also by drug developers, regulators, HTA bodies, and payers who have to evaluate the importance of different multiple myeloma treatment outcomes according to the patient population. And there is a specific type of methodology, which is called patient preference studies, that allows researchers and drug decision makers to investigate what matters most to patients. In a patient preference study, a sample of patients participates as study participants. So patients like Caroline take part in a patient preference study. And we use qualitative and quantitative methodologies to investigate their preferences. And now we talk about preferences, but what do we mean with preferences? There are several types of information that come out of a patient preference study. So first of all, we investigate what matters most to patients, what are the treatment outcomes, the risks, side effects of treatments that are most important to patients. How much do these aspects matter to patients? So what is their relative importance? And what are the benefit-risk trade-offs that patients are willing to make? So what is the amount of benefits that patients require in order to obtain a certain risks? And on the other way around, what is the maximum amount of risk that a patient is willing to take in order to obtain a certain benefit? Finally, we also obtain information on preference heterogeneity. So this is whether there are any subgroups in the patient population that have systematically different preferences based on their patient characteristics. For example, treatment experience, disease experience can all be factors that can determine whether a patient has a certain preference. I will explain the concept of patient preference studies and preference methodologies using a case example in multiple myeloma. So currently we are investigating patient preferences among the myeloma patient population. And to address the first research question, namely what matters most to multiple myeloma patients, we have conducted a large-scale qualitative study. And a qualitative study consisted of focus group discussions with multiple myeloma patients across Europe. So across 4 different countries, we invited patients to take part in a group discussion and discuss what matters most to them concerning their treatment. Now, what did we find out by talking to these patients? As you can see from the size of the balloon, there were several elements addressed in these focus group discussions. And these fall into 2 categories. So first, positive treatment expectations. So why do patients take a treatment? And on the negative side, what is a reason or a factor that patients would want patients to stop taking a treatment or doubt whether they want to continue a treatment. So from the positive side, patients hope for a treatment that extends their lives. As I mentioned, multiple myeloma patients on 5 years have less than 50% chance to survive. So naturally, they hope for a treatment to extend their life. Also, they hope that the treatment can reduce their cancer signs and symptoms. But then there is a lot of room left for the negative elements that were also highlighted and discussed extensively. And these are both the symptoms and the side effects that patients want to avoid. So for example, for the symptoms, they discussed several symptoms that really hamper them in performing their daily activities. And one of them was the mobility problems. So multiple myeloma patients have a very high chance to have bone fractures. And from both a physical point of view as a psychological point of view, this is very detrimental to them. So they are afraid to do an activities because they are afraid to have a bone fracture, and they cannot do like normal their activities. So and as well, from a side effect point of view, there are several side effects that patients are currently experiencing that they do not want or that they are afraid that will occur to them on a later term. For example, cognitive or thinking issues really hampers them in performing their jobs. Related to both the positive and the negative effects, they also are burdened with uncertainties about this. So from the positive treatment outcomes, they are afraid, how long will this treatment continue to work for me? And from the negative aspects, how long will these symptoms keep burdening my quality of life? What other side effects can I expect on the long term? Will I be experiencing these side effects for the rest of my life? The final 3 research questions here mentioned on the slide, we are investigating in a subsequent quantitative study. And this quantitative study consists of an online survey that we disseminate to more than 300 patients across Europe, so across different European countries. And in this online survey, we are using a methodology that is called discrete choice experiment. And discrete choice experiment requires patients to make a choice between two alternative treatment options, so hypothetical treatment options. And on the left-hand side, you see the different treatment features we identified in a qualitative phase. And on the right-hand side, you see how these treatments differ regarding these treatment features. And based on these differences, patients participating in our online survey need to choose which of the two treatments they prefer. Now, take for example a patient that will always, because this is only one question, but we are asking 15 of these questions. So imagine that a patient will always select the treatment that gives him the most life expectancy. Then this means that for this patient, life expectancy is the most important treatment attribute. How will we use this information, or how do we aim to use this information across the drug life cycle? So to start off with, at the top of the slide, you see we want to identify what are the unmet treatment needs according to the multiple myeloma patient population. So for example, find a cure for multiple myeloma is important for patients, but also find something that is alleviating for their pain. We can also identify what are the treatment features that are most important for patients, so treatment characteristics. And in a clinical development, we can identify what are the endpoints that matter most. Is it increasing life expectancy alone, or for example, also reducing their pain? At HTA and benefit risk level, regulators and HTA bodies can use the information from our study to evaluate whether the treatment they are evaluating targets any of the symptoms or endpoints, outcomes that matter most to patients. And then finally, in the post-marketing area, it can inform the development of a shared decision-making model between patients and physicians. I'm not investigating this alone. We are doing this in a large consortium, which is called PREFER, where academia and industry are collaborating to find out what are the best methodologies to elicit preferences and how this information can inform drug development and evaluation. So within the PREFER project, we are trying to investigate what are the best methodologies to elicit preferences. And we will develop, by 2022, recommendations towards drug developers, regulators, and HTA bodies on how patient preferences should be conducted in order to inform decision-making across the drug life cycle. And in parallel, we are seeking a qualification advice from the European Medicines Agency and UNETA on whether the methodologies that we are applying are robust enough to inform their respective decisions.
Making shared decision-making a reality is an important topic, and Dr. Niki Ver Donck performed her PhD on the development of a patient decision aid in breast cancer towards shared decision-making in Belgium.
This is Linda. Linda is a woman of 65 years old, and she received the diagnosis of hormone-sensitive breast cancer a few years ago. First, Linda received surgery, then radiation therapy, and then finally she started taking adjuvant endocrine therapy. Unfortunately, Linda experiences quite a few side effects, and they have quite a big impact on her quality of life. For example, joint and muscle pain. Now Linda, she heard from her friends in her breast cancer support group that they are taking other therapies, and she's wondering whether she's also eligible to switch to another therapy. She's looking for information, but can't really find the useful information or understandable information that she needs anywhere. She would like to discuss this with her physician, but she's not really sure how to engage in this conversation. In this presentation, we are going to find a solution for Linda. Over the years, we have applied different models in medical decision-making. Historically, the paternalistic model is the one that is most often applied. In this model, the information flows from the physician to the patient, and the physician is the sole decision maker. On the other hand, you have the model of informed decision-making, in which again the information flows from the physician to the patient, but in this case, the patient is the sole decision maker. This model is, for example, applied for patients that are entering in clinical trials. The model that I would like to discuss today is the model of shared decision making, in which information flows from the physician to the patient and from the patient back to the physician. In this case, we have two decision makers. Now, when should the model of shared decision making be applied? First of all, when there is no clear best therapy choice that is clearly the best therapy for the patient, or when the evidence supporting one of the therapy options is considerably uncertain. Finally, when the trade-offs between potential benefits and risks really depend on your personal point of view, it is important to engage in this model of shared decision-making. Now, how should you apply the model of shared decision-making? First of all, the physician should clearly state to the patient that there is a decision to be made and that the preferences of the patient matter. Next, the physician should explain all the available options and the benefits and risk associated with every option. Then, the patient, on her turn, she shares her personal values and preferences, both for the available options and for her points in the decision-making process, whether she wants to engage in shared decision-making or not. Then finally, the patient and the physician, they discuss the preferred role of the patient in the decision-making, and they come to one joint decision. To apply shared decision-making, both the physician and the patient need to be actively engaged in this process. This is not an easy task. Luckily, we have tools available to help them. These tools are patient decision aids, and they exist in various formats. They can be paper-based, with different visual representations of benefits and risks, or they may contain a table that clearly shows a comparison for the patient of different options. There also exist multimedia applications, such as videos or online tools. These formats have the advantage that they can individualize the information for every patient and that they can use storytelling to really make the information understandable for the patients. Now, what exactly is a patient decision aid and how does it differ from general health information? A patient decision aid has three aims. First of all, it should contain all the relevant information on the disease and the different options. Secondly, a patient decision aid should help the patient to compare different options and to form preferences. Finally, a patient decision aid will support the patient in communicating these preferences to the physician. Now, why is this relevant in hormone-sensitive breast cancer, and even more specifically for patients that are taking adjuvant endocrine therapy? First of all, there are two medical options available here. On the one hand, you have tamoxifen. On the other hand, you have aromatase inhibitors. Either way, these patients have a very long treatment pathway in which non-adherence is quite common because these patients can suffer quite a few side effects. This leads, of course, to non-optimal outcomes. Further, the treatment impact varies considerably between patients, which really underlines the need to make an individual preference-based decision. Finally, in some cases, the treatment benefits may even be limited for the patient that takes this therapy, which may last up to 5 or even 10 years. A study in Belgian patients with hormone-sensitive breast cancer and their physicians came to the following conclusions. First of all, patients and physicians have quite a different perspective on whether or not they are currently engaging in shared decision-making. Secondly, it found that patients need the relevant information, understandable information, and even more specifically, numeric information. They need this to properly engage in the process of shared decision-making because otherwise they have no information to base their preferences on. Next, it found that physicians fear that patients would not sufficiently understand the decision context when using a patient decision aid. So when developing a patient decision aid, it is really important to include the physicians and the patients in this process to ensure this understanding. Fourth, both within the physicians and within the patients, we saw that their preferences vary considerably. So it really depends on your individual point of view, whether one benefit or one side effect is more important than another one. This clearly underlines the need for individual decisions. Then finally, there were two already very useful options identified that should be included when developing a patient decision aid, and that is the option to make notes for the patient while using the decision aid, and also the option to print them afterwards, so they can use this for their discussion with their physician. Next, a prototype decision aid was developed, explaining all relevant characteristics of every therapy option. It also included clear numeric information, and it made it easy for the patients to compare different options because they were displayed next to each other. This prototype, as I already told you, was co-created with patients and physicians because this is so important. They gave feedback during different steps of the development process to really ensure that the end product meets the needs of the end users. Now, what do we need in Belgium to promote the practice of shared decision-making? First of all, we need a strong signal from policymakers. We need guidelines on how and when to engage in shared decision-making, and we need proper funding, both to implement this process and for the development of patient decision aids. As you can imagine, that, for example, these online tools need quite a big budget to make it happen. Secondly, the various initiatives that already exist at this point, they should come together. They should be unified in one collective approach. This way, if all the available decision aids are centralized, it would also make them easier to find for patients. Then third, we need proper training for healthcare professionals, because to engage in this model of decision-making, it really requires a certain attitude and knowledge from the healthcare provider. Then finally, we also need to increase public awareness in both patients and the general public that patients have the right to engage in their decision-making and together with their physician choose the best medical option for their care. Only if we succeed in delivering these 4 aims, Linda and other future patients will really be able to engage in shared decision-making and to obtain personal therapy choices that are in line with their preferences. Only then they will truly receive patient-centered care.
Patient involvement in medical decision-making starts with really talking to patients and patient representatives. We have the honor today to welcome our external guest, Jan Geissler, who is co-founder of several patient advocacy groups and today also CEO of Patvocates. Jan Geissler will talk about patient involvement at the level of the design and the conduct of clinical trials. Jan, we are really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Isabelle, for your introduction and for inviting me to this forum. I'm Jan Geissler. I'm a patient advocate and cancer patient for about 20 years. I'm a former director of EUPADI and a very passionate patient advocate for the engagement of patients in research. And what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of minutes is about the trials we want as patients, the value of engaging patients in the design and conduct of clinical trials. So, how do patient organizations operate? Because I want to start with what our role is and how we actually engage with the healthcare system that is very largely supplier-driven, not really demand-driven, so not really focused on what the patients want, but what the system is providing to patients. And that's why I want to explain in the beginning what patients' organizations do. And I think everybody's familiar with the first level, the core business, what we would call in business terms, is provide patient patient support. So all the local support groups, the national meetings, the online webinars, the brochures, and all the things that we do, the hotlines and the online forums and the Facebook groups. So providing peer-to-peer support to patients. We're increasingly involved in healthcare regulatory policy, so we're involved in all kinds of forums. We're engaged on the European level with the different institutions of the European Union, but of course on the national level. And we're trying to have a seat when decisions are taken in terms of healthcare policy, research policy, and all these things that patients' needs are really at the center. And then thirdly, we're increasingly engaged in research. So patient organizations try to support, drive, be engaged in research where it happens. And not all organizations are doing all three levels. Some just focus on patient support, some focus mainly on healthcare policy and representation of the patient voice, and some are really research-focused foundations, and some organizations do all of that. And I'm, of course, focusing on the third bit, an area where I have been very engaged over the last 20 years as a patient advocate, because I wanted to make sure that the patient voice is actually included in research. And why is that? Because academic and industry research can learn a lot, as well as regulators, what patients really want. Because everybody's talking about patient centricity and these glossy statements on all kinds of websites, no matter whether it's industry, institutions, or academic institutes. But in the end, only patients really understand what it means to live day by day with a disease or with a therapy, and how it affects the whole ecosystem around the patient. So not only the patient themselves, but also their families, their carers, their workplace, whatever. So really getting insights into the day-to-day reality of patients outside of the pure clinical setting is something only patient organizations usually see. They see the full picture. They understand the unmet need and the real value to patients, because very often we talk about clinical value, but we're not talking about what is really valuable to patients as such. If you look at the whole continuum, the day-to-day reality. Of course, patients want to co-create clinical trials because it's very valuable for academic researchers and industry and regulators to understand how services, info resources, and trials should actually be designed, because it's of no use to patients to run studies that actually don't recruit or don't deliver meaningful results. And that's why in the end, even though we spend a lot of money in research, there's always a shortage of money in the system. So leading to wiser investment of limited resources is something that really want to achieve with patient engagement. And of course, patients can drive research, especially in rare diseases. We've seen this very often where there was no commercial interest or no academic interest or no attention to one of the 6,000 rare diseases. That's where patients said, we really need to make a difference and let us drive research. And why is it not enough just to ask the experts and the clinicians about what patients want? Because we often hear, well, aren't we patients sometime anyway, and we know what my patients want. But if you look at that data, that was a survey that Myeloma Patients Euronet actually conducted in 2009, and they asked about 300 physicians and nurses, about 260 patients and carers, and they asked them one question in the survey about the treatment side effects with the most negative impact on overall well-being in multiple myeloma. And you can see the blue bar are physicians, the orange bar are patients. And now you can see that the perceptions of whether something really has a very negative impact on the day-to-day reality of patients was by magnitudes different between physicians and patients. So if you just look at hair loss, physicians thought that's much less important than the patients thought. Or if you look at neuropathy, thumbness of the fingers, something that the clinicians, because it's a very clinical thing, was highly important, while only about 50% of patients this was important. Same for respiratory and others. Of course, this is myeloma specific, but we see similar data also in other diseases like cancer, CML, and others. And that's why it's important not only to ask the ones that speak on behalf of us, but ask the patient themselves what is really important and what has the most negative impact on their daily life, because then we know where the therapeutic gaps are. And then why is it important to ask the patients and the clinicians when engaging in research? And Ian Chalmers, one of the co-founders of the Cochrane collaboration, actually published a very important paper in The Lancet in 2009, where he actually brought up the hypothesis that 85% of research is wasted because we're doing the wrong things. On one hand, we ask questions that are not relevant to clinicians and patients. We don't use the appropriate design and methods. We might not publish the results, or the reports might be biased. And I don't want to go into detail of that because I don't have the time, and I just focus on one. And you can see some of the topics that he brought up in terms of, are the questions relevant in research? Are they relevant to patients? We see that in a number of research projects, low priority questions are being addressed, important outcomes are not being assessed, or clinicians and patients are not involved in research and setting the research agenda. So that's why it's important. And I think it's today more widely understood than it was 15 years ago that we need to more go to a demand-driven model, that we actually put the patient at the center of healthcare decision-making, of policy and research. And we can see this is being reflected increasingly because patients are increasingly involved in regulatory authorities like the EMA, who's been involving patients since 2005, and also in other regulatory authorities. We're increasingly involved in policy, in research ethics committees, in health technology assessment agencies when reimbursement decisions are being made, and in clinical research. And I want to focus on the latter bit and explain that in a bit more detail. So how does systematic patient involvement in the design and conduct of clinical trials look like? And some years ago, we've actually published this kind of roadmap. And you can actually see the research or the clinical trial cycle here from setting the research priorities over research design and planning towards the implementation, the running and conduct of studies. And then if it's a phase 3 study, then going into market authorization and post-approval processes. And all these black blurbs that you actually see, the black text here, are things that, for example, the HIV community has been doing for 20 years. So this is not a new invention on patient engagement in R&D. There are established processes and there are examples of where patients can actually provide valuable input into the design of clinical studies. And I don't want to explain that in detail. You can also read our paper on that. But I want to highlight one point because we're talking about clinical trial design here. So where's the input? What's the value of patient input in the design of clinical studies? Very often we see the discussions that patient priorities and risk-benefit need to be discussed very early. So how do you weigh up the risk of new therapy against the potential benefit? And how do you assess that apart from purely the clinical outcomes, towards the patient reality, and sometimes, especially in oncology and very difficult to treat diseases, there's often a very tight balance of risk and benefit that needs to be judged. Patient-relevant endpoints, it might be that in advanced cancer, it might not be as relevant for patients to have the primary and secondary endpoint focused on survival, while probably quality of life is much more important for patients at that stage of disease. And that needs to be found out and discussed at the design stage. The same applies to pro instruments. Very often we see that ineffective or not really meaningful pro instruments are being used in studies, or no pro instruments at all, or just the ones that actually help to quantify a QALY to get into health technology assessment later on. And we have these discussions very often in how often do we use pro tools and which pro instruments do we use to have a meaningful picture that is actually measured in a valid way and a validated way in the end, how the quality of life is. Then inclusion-exclusion criteria we often see, and of course that's the intent of studies, to have a good proof of the therapeutic effect and also to prevent patients or participants from potential harm. So usually exclusion criteria are quite strict, but we often need to discuss about why, for example, there's an age limit. In my disease, in my cancer, for example, the usual phase 3 studies are at an average age of 47, even though the incidence of the cancer that I have is usually at 65, which excludes, of course, all the people that have comorbidities. But how much does it tell us then about the real-world application of those drugs if we don't know about what it means to have it together with diabetes or cardiovascular disease or whatever, which is very prevalent in older ages? Or how can we support patients on mobility logistics when they join studies? How can we make the administration of the drug, for example, with supportive devices or other ways to administer the drug or other time points, more amenable for those that might be obliged to turn up for the study every week or every second week in the study? Is it really necessary to have bone marrow diagnostics so often? Where is the borderline between essential knowledge that we generate and nice to have diagnostics? And I can tell I've had discussions about pediatric studies with a high frequency of bone marrow biopsies. And even though I could understand the scientific rationale, I said, no parent is going to actually recruit their kid into that study if you keep up that schedule. And that's very important to discuss. Or ethical aspects where we had strong discussions about crossover, because we said you're going to have a huge drop-off rate if people progress and they can't cross over to the other therapy arm, even though it's an issue with data quality and potentially the number of patients you need to recruit. You cannot run this study without a crossover because patients will run away or not even join that. So I hope I could illustrate some of the factors that we frequently discuss. And I'm not saying we know it better than researchers. We're not trying to be better scientists, but we have a different perspective. And if that is being discussed and regarded at the trial design stage, the results later on will be much more meaningful and will probably also have quantifiable benefits, for example, the lower number of amendments to the trial protocol, or let's say faster recruitment or less dropout rates. So even there are publications about the quantifiable financial benefit of involving patients in study design. But reality is different at the moment. You can see that in those bars here, because the involvement, the closer companies go through towards a market authorization application and reimbursement decisions, that's where suddenly patient voice becomes very different, because the hope is that patients will advocate for that therapy. But the impact on patients is much higher when we can discuss at the design stage whether the questions matter. And that's why the left side is much more important, much more impactful, and in the end, by the end result, much better for the healthcare system and the researcher and the company and the academic researchers if input happens on the left side. But of course, that requires, because it's still far away from market authorization, requires a different approach in phase 1, phase 2 of clinical studies, because that's where a lot of things are still unclear. And of course, you need to have an educated patient community that can contribute to that. Because there's no shortcut to knowledge, the path to evidence-based advocacy is there in our community, and one is training and the other one is evidence. So we've set up the European Patients Academy, EUPADI, in 2012. It was run and coordinated by the European Patients Forum in a consortium project of 33 consortium members, including pharmaceutical industry, close collaboration with different regulators, and key 4 pan-European key patient umbrellas. What we developed there was actually a whole expert training for patient advocates on the topics that you see on the right, from the preclinical phase over clinical development, clinical trials, pharmacovigilance, regulatory affairs, health technology assessment. And we've done an expert course where we trained about 250 patient experts of more than 60 disease areas for more than 30 countries over the last couple of years. And we've also broken that down into what I would call the Wikipedia of drug development for lay people, the EUPADI toolbox, which you can find on the link below. And we've provided this in about a dozen languages, because we know that not everybody's speaking English. So this is all freely available on the website, and it was released by Creative Commons license. Because the whole goal is that we want to work with evidence, because it doesn't help if Jan has an opinion. It helps if we can bring data, because healthcare is very data driven, that we bring our own data from our patients and patient advocacy members on bring evidence that we can actually convince regulators, academics, industry, policymakers about what the true patient need is. So That has three elements: targeted advocacy. So we need to think about whom do we talk to. The messages to a politician is very different to the messages to an academic researchers. We need really good data. So we need to collect the evidence from our community. And of course, the right packaging that people understand what we're trying to bring in. That sweet spot in the middle is evidence-based advocacy, where we've where we've done tremendous efforts over the last 2-3 years to train up our community to advocate in a target, evidence-based, well-educated and professional manner, and not just talking about our story and about the emotions that are connected with having a disease. And there's a lot of examples around this. Evidence-based advocacy basically works in three main areas. Of course, disease mapping, where we are trying to map out what's the patient experience, what's the quality of life of patients, what's the burden on disease and symptoms, what are the unmet patient needs, or what is, for example, adherence. We can, of course, run patient preference studies to actually understand if you weigh up the bad and the ugly, what do you decide for, and what are the clusters within a patient community to understand what kind of subgroup might have which preference. And this is really, really important. And for example, Melanoma Patients Europe and Myeloma Patients Europe and Melanoma Patient Network Europe have run a joint project with the EMA on patient preferences on benefit risk. And you can see a couple of more examples here on screen. And of course, inequality mapping is very important because we need to understand where are the differences in access, what are the reasons for access, what are the vulnerable groups and the people left behind, why do people access treatment here and not there, what are the difference between country borders. And for example, Myeloma Patients Europe has done a fantastic project on the Access Atlas to map that out all across Europe. So you can see a couple of examples. So again, evidence-based advocacy is not something new or something that will be there in the future. We're doing this increasingly, and we're trying to build the capacity to be good partners of researchers and to make sure that we're being understood and we can actually work on equal eye level on designing studies and doing healthcare policy that really matters to us. And with that, I'd like to close with a call that we're really trying to make clinical research more meaningful and effective, and patient engagement can really help to design more meaningful clinical trials, and make clinical trials more effective and deliver really to patients' needs. Thank you so much.
I thank all speakers for the valuable presentations. Now we have some time for Q&A, and we switch to the live streams of all the speakers of today. Welcome. Yes, here we are in our question and answer session. We got a lot of questions in our session today, which is very nice. And this is actually the moment that we can discuss this with our expert, with the presenters of today. So please note that this question and answer session will also be recorded. And so then we can proceed by now. Our external speaker, Jan Geissler, thanks a lot for your presentation. I have a question to you. You are already for a long time in this field with experiences working with patients and also with regulators and other decision makers. So what is actually your experience in terms of the evolution of patient involvement in different steps of decision making at the different levels of the drug development process?
Well, thank you so much for that question. I think it's very, very important thing because we can see over the last couple of years, patient advocacy has changed largely. I mean, when I started with patient advocacy about 20 years ago, we were all grassroots or organizations just acting in our own disease area, while today we're a network, a wide community across diseases, outside, inside oncology, rare diseases, and so on. And I think this kind of cohesion between the different organizations has helped a lot to actually increase knowledge and also professionality of the patient organizations not to lose sight of what is important to the patient on the ground, but really to work together, share best practice, build our knowledge, and so on, be a strong partner. And the second thing, which is really important, is the move towards evidence. While we've always been watching what kind of evidence came out of research, today we are more and more generators of evidence with our own surveys, our own evidence that we generate, but also participation in the design of like patient preference studies that we've heard in the sessions today, because in the end, we are in touch with all the patients out there, and we can help that the data being generated in these is really, let's say, designed in the right ways, used in the right way, and is applied in regulatory decision-making or when clinical trials are being designed. And I think this whole move towards evidence-based advocacy is probably the strongest evolution we've been going through in the last 2, 3, 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks a lot. And I think that is especially what I want to ask now in the following question. So this use of patient input, and more specifically patient preferences in the context of the regulatory decision-making. My question is here, and it's a question from the chat to Rosanne Janssens, about the point that indeed patients differ. They have different characteristics, and we call this patient heterogeneity. How is patient heterogeneity playing a role, and how is it dealt with at the national level more centrally when benefit-risk assessments need to take place, for instance, at the EMA level? Or is it most of the time only useful for decision-making at the national level, for instance, at the reimbursement decision-making? So what is your expert view here?
So thanks a lot for the question. I think it's a very relevant question. So what we try to do with the patient preference study is to find out indeed what are the aspects that matter most to patients. And what we revealed in the study that we performed so far is where we included patients from several countries across Europe, and that they actually pointed towards the same aspects of treatment that matter most to them. So this regards life expectancy or survival, another word for it, but as well a lot of aspects related to quality of life, symptoms and side effects that really affect them in doing their activities. And this was actually the same across regardless of where the patients lived, so regardless of their country. So this is an interesting finding, and I think it also aligns with what we see in quality of life questionnaires, which are also implemented across different patients from different countries, that regardless of their nationality, they actually have the same priorities in terms towards what they find important aspects of treatments. Where the difference lies is, I think, in how much are they willing to accept of a risk in order to obtain a certain benefit, and how much do they value these different aspects. I think this is really individual, and this is what we also try to investigate with the patient preference study. And this we do more in the quantitative phase or in the survey, where we try to quantify individual relative importance according to patients. And here I expect, of course, that there will be large heterogeneity in terms of different patients according to their patient characteristics. And so countries, one possible characteristics where we will try to investigate whether this variable has an effect on, so a statistically significant effect on how much value they attach to a certain treatment aspect, but as well as their treatment experience or their disease experience, age and so on, are all important variables that we ask to patients in order to relate this to the results and contextualize also the results of the patient preference study. So, and then in terms of how do we take this into account in decision making, I think still is an unresolved question. But I think for one point, it's important to report transparently about the patient sample and about the heterogeneity that was revealed through a preference study. And then decision makers can see for which patient population this preference study gives useful results. So tailoring actually or seeing to what aspect that the patient sample relates in terms of the decision that they will be affected by them. So to see whether there's an alignment, and if so, I think that can inform their decision.
Yes.
I don't know if this is
Yes, that's very clear, Rosanne. Thanks a lot. And indeed, that's about the decision making at the regulatory level. This decision-making which directly affects the treatment of patients, that's at the individual level, so the shared decision-making level, and that's the talk that Niki gave. So Niki, I have a question to you. You were developing into your research a patient decision aid in the context of breast cancer. What is your most relevant learning that you want to share with us in developing such a patient decision aid based on your experience?
So thank you for that question. For me personally, the most important learning was that patients really want to engage in shared decision making. And we don't often see that already nowadays in Belgium or in Flanders. But patients really do want to participate, and they just require the right information, understandable information, and sometimes just the reassurance from the physician that it's okay to engage and that they have the right to engage and to decide on their own therapy. And for me, this also relates to what our health minister said at the beginning of the talk. The health literacy of patients differs. So it's really important to give them access to information that they can understand on different levels, that they can use the information they require and use, whether it's written information or videos or even something else, or in interviews, for example, with patients, but that they can really use the information they need to come to a decision, or that they can go into a discussion with their physician. So that was for me the most important, really adapting whatever we have in healthcare to make it more easy for the patients to engage in shared decision making.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I understand. And indeed, different treatment options exist, but still today there are a lot of unmet medical needs. Patients that do not have a treatment option available for their different diseases. But there are many different unmet medical needs. I have a question, Jan. Maybe you can help us with your expert view about from the patient, insight from the patients. So how would you advise us to balance different priorities related to unmet medical needs? How do we prioritize at the European level, at the national level, at the disease level? Can we make a prioritization of unmet medical needs in the context of treatments, in the context of preventive measures, think of vaccines and so forth? So what is actually your view about, where can we invest first in? What are the steps forward in this context of unmet medical needs?
Well, I think the first point that is really important is to move away from unmet medical needs towards unmet patient needs, because in medical, we strongly think about symptoms and side effects and, let's say, clinical targets, while we need to think more about what really counts for patients in a specific disease at a specific stage in a specific living context. And we've seen that same disease, same stage, same age doesn't mean same preference. And when we really understand what patients have and where the subpopulations are that are worst served at the moment with current solutions, then we can probably start to find solutions for them. So I think that's really important. And there's no way around asking patients about what they want, because our healthcare system is very let's say, supply driven. So we just provide solutions where we think there is unmet need, but we're not asking patients about what they really want. So from that perspective, if we change that paradigm in really saying, let's go to the patient communities, let's identify the subpopulations, let's work with them to understand what the real needs are and also the magnitude of need, then we can probably take these difficult decisions. And like I was presenting also in the presentation, is there's a lot of waste in the system, and probably we don't need to decide that we can't do A because we want to do B. It would probably more wise to think about where do we do things that we don't need to do, and we free up resources to do A and B, but really based on what patients really think is important.
Yes. And I think I have a last question. So we do a lot of research on patient involvement, patient preference studies, creation of patient decision aids, and so forth. And we want that this all comes to reality. Rosanne, I have a question. Do you know about a particular example where really patient preference studies have yielded to results that really informed decision-making in real life?
Yeah, I think that's also a good question to reflect on the reality currently. So there are several pilot studies, let's say, in the area of decision making, where both HTA bodies, regulators, industry are piloting several methods to investigate their usefulness for informing their decisions. And then Prefer is, of course, also piloting several methods for investigating preferences. But where has it actually informed a specific decision? I think about a study that was conducted in collaboration with NICE, so the HTA body in the UK, where NICE has provided scientific advice to a study of a pharmaceutical company to see that the study at the end can inform the clinical trial endpoints included in the development program of this pharmaceutical company, and then afterwards also with the aim that it informs also the HTA procedure at the level of NICE decision making. So this is one example. Another example is more in the US. So a US-based study where a preference study was conducted to inform regulatory assessment of a drug, and so where it also informed FDA on their benefit risk assessment. But in Europe, the NICE example is the one that comes to mind at first.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Rosanne. Thanks a lot, everyone, all the experts here, for giving your final thoughts here also in this Q&A session. There are indeed a lot of questions and still a lot of research to do. We will still do in the coming years altogether. The slides will become available for everyone, as also the recordings will be. To the audience, please contact us, contact the students, contact us as supervisors as well as the experts. We remain available to give you more insights and more thoughts about everything. Our next upcoming session on clinical evidence gaps in decision-making will be May 7th. We invite you for this new session, and we thank you a lot for your participation.